Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the topic of flooding. Today we will cover the recently published World Bank Global Gas Flooding Tracker Report for 2022 and is presented by Subin Banji and David Walker of the World Bank GGFR Partnership. IPCA is a supporting organization to the World Bank Zero Routine Flooding by 2030 initiative, and it's a pleasure to have the GGFR presenting this webinar today. My name is Lorena Perez. I'm Senior Manager for Climate Change here at IPCA. And before we start, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. Everything you can see, including the slides, is resizable and movable, so feel free to move things around and get the most out of your screen. At the bottom of your screen, you will see some features that are available. You can use the Q&A box to ask questions as we go, and we will follow up with them at the end of the presentations or afterwards via email. Also, there is a help feature, but most of the issues can be sorted by refreshing the page using the F5 key. And this is particularly useful if you think your slides are falling behind. And a recording will be available later this week and can be accessed using the same link you are using now. And now I would like to say a few brief words about IPCA for those of you who are not familiar with the organization. IPCA is the Global Oil and Gas Association dedicated to advancing environmental and social performance across the energy transition. We bring together members and stakeholders to lead in integrating sustainability by advancing climate action, environmental responsibility, and social performance across oil, gas, and renewables activities. We were formed back in 1974 following the launch of UNEP, the UN Environment Programme. And we are the only global association for both the upstream and downstream oil and gas industry. We are not an advocacy organization and concentrate on technical and fact-based information. In 2022, IPCA launched membership principles as a new condition of membership. And these principles are grouped under the association's 4 strategic pillars of climate, nature, people, and sustainability. And each thematic area includes 2 principles. The first provides support for a UN Nations Convention or initiative under our climate pillar. For example, this includes support for the Paris Agreement. And the second is designed to advance the environmental and social performance of IPCA member companies' operations, so it's operational. And also in March this year, we released the second SDGs roadmap progress report, providing highlights on how the roadmap is being implemented, including case studies for member companies, as well as examples of how the roadmap actions are embedded in the IPCA's business plan. And I'm pleased that this webinar on flooding and its reduction will bring to life several of the SDGs. So not just the SDG 7 on access to energy, but SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 9 on infrastructure, or SDG 17 on partnership and collaboration. And to reduce the footprint of oil and gas operations and minimize scope 1 and 2 emissions, especially in the near term to 2030, then 2 opportunities really stand out. One is methane reduction, and the other is reducing flooding, which is why jointly with IOGP and the World Bank GGFR, IPCA has produced a guidance document on flooding management for the oil and gas industry, and which is why IPCA is a supporting organization of the GGFR Zero Routine Flooding Initiative. As I mentioned earlier, we are joined by Subin Banji and David Walker of the World Bank GGFR Partnership. You can find Subin and David's bios on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'm very pleased to welcome back the World Bank GGFR, who joined us for other webinars on flooding for the last couple of years. And I'm really looking forward to hear what has happened in the interim. So now over to you, Subin, and then David.
Well, thank you so much, Lorena, and thanks to IPCA for inviting us back another year for this webinar. And thank you for joining us. My name is Zubin Bavji, as Lorena said, and I manage the bank's GGFR Trust Fund and Partnership. As some of you may know, we are a group of governments, companies, and multilateral organizations working to end routine flaring and venting by 2030. We spend much of our time working with governments and NOCs to understand and remove the technical, regulatory, financial barriers to flaring reduction. If you're interested in learning more about our work program, I encourage you to visit our websites. Just to go to your web browser and type in GGFR or zero routine flaring, and you'll get quite a bit of information about what we do and some of our main initiatives and also programs. So for the last few years, we've been invited by IPCA to present an overview of the state of global gas flaring. And we really welcome and appreciate this opportunity to update industry and others on any developments in this issue. Every year, our team spends considerable time gathering and analyzing satellite data that is then used to produce our annual flaring tracker report, which you can find on our website as well, along with flaring data visualization. What I mean by that is if you go to our website, we have a portal that shows you every single gas flare on Earth, how much the estimated flaring volumes are, the estimated emissions, and much more information. I think you might find it fascinating and interesting. And this is something that we think is really helpful for industry to see how much progress we've made in this regard. I'm joined today by Debbie Walker, my colleague, who has led our work for the last 2 years on the Flare Tracker Report. Debbie also works on our broader technical program, as Lorena mentioned earlier. So she's going to take us through the satellite data estimates for 2022 and also discuss our estimates for methane emitted through flaring and the imported flare gas index, which was a metric on flaring that we at the World Bank and GGFR came up with about 2 years ago. And then at the end, we'll have some time for any questions or comments. Now, as you may know, last year, 2022, was a very volatile year for the industry, the oil and gas industry, I should be more specific. The Russian invasion of Ukraine destabilized the supply and the demand of oil, as well as traditional flows of imports and exports. Many countries around the world faced higher prices and the prospect of unprecedented disruption to what we know as energy security. In brief, this was the context for our sector in 2022, and that gives you the sort of sense of what the overall picture on flaring could have been as well. So in 2022, we had some relatively good news. Our satellite data and analysis shows that around 139 billion cubic meters, or BCM, of associated gas was flared globally last year. This is about a 3% decrease from 2021, which had about 144 BCM flared. This is the lowest global flaring volume since 2010, so well over a decade. So again, this is welcome news and encouraging news for us in GGFR and many of us in the industry as well, right? Now, you may be wondering, where were the main decreases? Our analysis from satellite data shows that there were 3 countries in particular that had decreases, and they are Nigeria, Mexico, and the United States. Now, the story for all 3 of these countries is different, and Debbie is going to share some of that with you in just a moment. But the progress does give us some hope that we may still be able to achieve our goal of ending routine flaring over the next 7 years. And particularly in those countries that have developed the right regulatory environment and also have coupled that regulatory environment with the political will and the prioritization of gas flaring and methane reduction. So in addition to Nigeria, Mexico, and the United States, our report will also highlight 2 countries, and you'll see it again on the website. And those 2 countries are Algeria and Egypt, where we believe there are opportunities for noteworthy reductions in the next few years. Both those governments have been doing the work that's necessary then to make those emissions reductions and that flaring reduction in the next few years. And again, Debbie will explain a little bit more of our thinking for those two countries. Now, perhaps contrary to the expectations of some, the report that we released also shows that decreased Russian gas exports to the European Union did not increase gas flaring in Russia. Many people would have thought that might be the case. We find that that was not the case. And the data also highlights the scale and the persistence of the gas flaring challenge. In 2022, we find that the top 9 countries flaring globally accounted for around 74% of all gas flared. So again, that's around 3/4 of gas flared globally done by just 9 countries. So we know where this is happening in large quantities, and that's what we want to prioritize and put all our attention and resources. Well, maybe not all, but most of it. And then finally, let me just say this year's report also considers the state of the science and the sort of uncertainty surrounding how much methane is released from flaring. What's concerning to us at the bank is that we're starting to learn that methane emissions due to flaring could be significantly higher than previously estimated. So we're going to do much more research around this in the near future. If this is a topic that interests you, please contact us because we welcome your views and perspectives on flare destruction efficiency. Much more definitely needs to be learned, and we would like to do that in the next few months to a year or two at the maximum. So anyway, let me just finish by saying there's no doubt many of these countries face significant barriers, a lot of challenges to addressing flaring and venting, and that's why we exist. Our partnership exists at the World Bank because it is a difficult problem, and the magnitude is quite large. So that's our job here at the World Bank. We're there to assist and support governments and NOCs with flaring and venting reduction. And in the future, we'll also be expanding our scope on methane emissions, fugitive methane emissions, and our trust fund will be evolving to accommodate that. So in the future, we will no longer be GGFR, we will be GFMR, which is the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. More on that in the future. But let me just hand over to Debbie, who will take us through some of our analysis and data for flaring for 2022. Thanks again for the opportunity. Debbie?
Thanks, Zubin. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to take you through this year's tracker report. So the presentation today will cover 4 key topics that broadly mirror the themes of this year's report. We'll take a look at our main key flaring indicators. We'll then discuss a little the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that had on flaring. We'll then look at the imported flare gas index and lastly talk about flaring and methane. So on to our key flaring indicators. The first of our key flaring indicators is, of course, global flare volume, which is shown here in red in units of billion cubic meters. And this is the data since records began. And those records are, of course, our satellite observations of flaring. Also shown here is global oil production, shown in black in units of million barrels of oil per day. And what we can see is a decoupling of flaring and oil production back in the early 2000s. And last year, our report focused on this plateau in flare volumes over the last few years. However, this year, as Zubin mentioned, we do see a resumption of that decoupling with a 3%, a 5 BCM decrease in gas flaring, occurring alongside a 5% or 3 million barrel of oil per day increase in oil production. And this is a welcome reduction in flaring, which is equivalent to taking around 3 million passenger vehicles off the road. In this slide, we look at the countries where the most significant changes up or down in global flaring occurred. And we can see that Nigeria contributed the most to the overall reduction with a 1.3 BCM reduction, which is a 20% reduction in flaring in Nigeria. This was largely associated with a decline in oil production in Nigeria. Next up is Mexico, where we saw a very welcome decrease after several years of a steady increase in flaring in Mexico. These reductions mainly occurred in the Cu-Malub-Zap fields and the Cantarell complex offshore and the Cactus conventional oil field onshore. And we believe these reductions are due to a change in government policy requiring the shutting in of high gas to oil ratio wells to control flaring. And we certainly welcome this policy change from the Mexican government. And lastly, I'll draw your attention to the US, which continue to make steady progress on flare reduction. And we have a slide with a little more detail on the US case a little further on. This slide shows the percentage share of the top 9 flaring countries relative to the rest of the world and compares the 2022 and 2012 scenarios. The global flare volume has declined slightly over that time, 4 BCM reduction, and the order of these countries has changed, but the top 9 countries have remained the same for the past 10 years. What's also notable is their share of global flaring has increased from 65% or 93 BCM in 2012 to 74%, 102 BCM in 2022, which demonstrates that progress in these major flaring countries has been lacking. As they dominate world flaring, much needs to be done in all these countries urgently, especially Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, and to a lesser extent, Algeria and Mexico. This chart shows the top 30 flaring countries ranked by their 2022 flare volume, with the flare volumes for the last 5 years indicated so you have an idea of the trend. As with previous years, flaring is dominated by those top 9 countries that account for 74% of all flaring and 45% of global oil production. This chart now shows flaring intensity, that is the amount of gas flared per barrel of oil produced, and this is another important metric for us. Again, it shows the top 30 flaring countries, so same as the previous chart, ranked in order of their 2022 flare volume. However, when we look at flaring intensity, you can see things change quite dramatically. And as with previous years, we see very high flaring intensities in our fragile and conflict-affected countries, like Yemen and Syria. So now moving on to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that that had on gas flaring over 2022. During 2022, European energy security was at the forefront of policymakers' agendas following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The report asks 2 key questions relevant to the critical and interrelated issues of energy supply and gas flaring as a consequence of the invasion. The first is, if Europe reduced its gas imports from Russia, did Russia resort to flaring this gas instead? And the second is, has there been a notable change in gas flaring in other countries as they increase gas export to Europe? We'll take a look at the evolution of flaring in some key countries that exported gas to the EU during 2022, specifically the US, Angola, Egypt, and Algeria. During June and July 2022, Gazprom dramatically reduced gas flows to Europe via the Nord Stream pipeline system, ostensibly due to prolonged maintenance issues with the critical compressor station. During August 2022, the system was operating at around 32 million cubic meters of gas per day, just 20% of its maximum capacity. And in late September, pipeline operations were halted completely after a subsea explosion and have yet to be restarted. So with the cessation of operations of Nord Stream, did Russia resort to flaring this gas instead? Well, perhaps contrary to expectations, there has not been an observable increase in flaring in Russia during 2022. Russia's flare volumes were largely static between 21 and 22, while oil production increased slightly by 2%, which led to a marginal decrease in Russia's flaring intensity. So now moving our focus to the EU and the consequential change in gas imports mix as a result of this dramatic shift away from Russian gas. This chart shows the change in LNG imports to the EU between 2021 and 2022. The data is year-to-date November. And as you can see, there was an increase in LNG import from the US, Angola, Norway, Qatar, and Egypt, and a decrease in LNG from Algeria, Nigeria, and of course, Russia. This chart now considers the change in pipeline gas imports to the EU. And as you can see, there have been increases in import from Azerbaijan, Norway, and the UK, as well as decreases in import from Libya, Algeria, and of course, Russia. In the next slides, we'll explore some of these gas exporting countries in a little more detail and specifically look at their progress or opportunity to recover and commercialize flare gas. The countries we will focus on are the US, Angola, and Egypt, all of whom increased LNG export to the EU during 2022, and Algeria, which decreased both pipeline and LNG export to the EU. So first up is the United States. In 2022, the US increased LNG export to the EU and continued to reduce flare gas volumes. Showcased in last year's report, the US has continued to seize opportunities for associated gas recovery and commercialization, and in 2022 achieved the lowest flaring intensity recorded in the last 10 years at just 1.8 cubic meters of gas flared per barrel of oil produced. The global average for reference was 4.7. Between 2021 and 2022, the US also increased LNG exports, with a marked increase in the portion of those exports going to the EU, at the same time as reducing flaring. The US example demonstrates the results that can be achieved when private companies seek to capitalize on gas market opportunities and are supported by strong regulation on flaring. The second country we will look at is Angola, another example of a country that has seized opportunities to commercialize its associated gas streams. In 2022, Angola increased its LNG export to the EU, and the LNG produced at the Angola LNG facility is produced solely from associated gas. That is gas that would have otherwise been flared offshore at oil production sites. Now, having started operations in 2013, the ALNG facility was shut down for 2 years to repair some design flaws. But since its restart of operations in 2016, the impact on Angola flaring has been marked and demonstrates the tremendous value that can be realized when the government, the national oil company, and the private sector work together to deliver solutions to reduce gas flaring. So now switching focus to countries where we believe opportunities remain to recover and commercialize flare gas streams. In 2022, Egypt increased its LNG export to the EU, but Egypt has an opportunity to recover and commercialize flare gas volumes. There has been some incremental progress in this direction, with Egypt reducing flare gas volumes consistently for the last 3 years. And these reductions are a result of several investments to recover and utilize associated gas. For example, in the Petrosanan-operated Alam El Shawish field in the Western Desert, flaring has reduced since 2018 due to increased pipeline infrastructure and additional compression capacity. Given the EU's sustained demand for gas, opportunities exist for Egypt to recover flare gas volumes and include these in its gas export streams. I should also note that we are aware of 2 smaller projects in Egypt to recover small flare volumes at local production sites and use that to generate power for both the facilities and the local community. So while not directly related to this discussion around European gas import, still very important, and we showcase and highlight those in this year's report. And the last of our country case studies, a country where opportunities remain, is Algeria. In 2022, Algeria decreased gas export to the EU, both in the form of LNG and via pipeline, although the pipeline changes were largely the result of the cessation of operations of the GME pipeline in Q4 21, which fed gas into Spain and Portugal. When we look at gas flaring in Algeria, there was a slight increase in flaring in 2022, although Algeria has achieved a reduction in flaring intensity over the last 3 years. This reduction in flaring intensity is understood to be the result of several investments in associated gas recovery at key oil-producing sites in Algeria. For example, the Hassi Messaoud region, the largest in Algeria, Sonatrach has made several upgrades to increase the recovery and reinjection of associated gas to avoid flaring and the chart on the left shows the impact that has had. However, in this time of increased concerns about energy security and with a sustained increase in demand for gas by the EU, there remains an opportunity for Algeria to recover its flare gas volumes and commercialise these through its gas export systems. And lastly, I just want to highlight some sustained progress in two developing countries, Kazakhstan and Colombia, to continue to reduce both flare volume and flaring intensity. Both these countries were spotlighted in last year's flaring tracker report, and although not directly relevant to the discussion on EU gas supply necessarily, we felt it was important to give them kudos again this year for their continued progress. Both of these countries are good examples of where strong regulation and indeed the enforcement of that regulation have played a role in addition to the market forces that we've spoken about in the previous slides. Both were also case studies in our global regulatory review last year. So moving on now to the imported flare gas index. As a reminder, the IFG index is based on the premise that if a country is importing crude oil, it's also importing the flaring intensity of those barrels. And the formula for the IFG index is shown here. Our intention is that the IFG index will help inform countries where the flaring hotspots are within their fossil fuel supply chain. And our ambition is that this leads countries that import oil to be more informed about the flaring consequence of the oil they import and engage in a dialogue with their suppliers about flaring performance and potentially lead to assistance in implementing flare reduction activities. This chart shows the IFG index of the top 20 highest IFG index Annex 1 countries, with the stack chart indicating how those values arise. Now, it's a little hard to read, but the colour represents the country the crude oil is imported from. And the larger the share of crude oil from that country, the more it will influence and contribute to the overall imported flare gas index, which is shown on the y-axis. So for example, countries like Greece and Italy have a high imported flare gas index because they import crude from Iraq and Libya, which are both very high flaring intensity oil producers. Another way of showing this is by plotting the highest crude importing countries, so those that import more than 250,000 barrels of oil per day, against their resulting imported flare gas index. So in this chart here, we have the volume of crude being imported on the x-axis and the resulting IFG index on the y-axis. The blue line represents the average flaring intensity globally for 2022, which is 4.71. And you can see that a number of countries have an imported flare gas index higher than this average as a result of the mix of crude that they import from high flaring producers. This year, we've also sought to evaluate the difference in imported flare gas index in countries between 2021 and 2022. And we can see from this chart that many countries actually experienced a decrease in imported flare gas index. The largest decrease came from Estonia, which imports crude from a single country. In 2021, it imported crude oil from Libya, which has a flaring intensity of 13.2. And in 2022, it changed to import crude from Kazakhstan, which has a much lower flaring intensity of 1.6. It's a similar story for Norway, which imported crude from a mix of countries in 2021, including some high flaring intensity countries such as Nigeria and Cameroon. And in 2022, changed to import crude from the UK only, which has a flaring intensity of 2.1. In the next slide, we'll take a closer look at Australia, a country that decreased its imported flare gas index, and compare that with a country that increased its imported flare gas index, Portugal. This slide shows the change in crude oil imports mix between 2021 and 2022 for both Portugal and Australia. For Portugal, which had the largest increase in IFG index in 2022, we can see that this was partly due to a decrease in oil imports from Nigeria and Brazil, and an increase in imports from higher flaring intensity countries like Algeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the case of Australia, which had a decrease in imported flare gas index, This is partly due to a decrease in oil imports from Malaysia and an increase in imports from the US, which has a much lower flaring intensity. And the last section for today's talk is on flaring and methane. Flares are a direct source of methane, but by how much is not well understood. In this year's report, we seek to explain the state of the science on methane emissions from flaring. Since the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions from flaring began, it's been underpinned by two core assumptions: that flares operate with a 98% destruction efficiency, so 2% of the methane is released uncombusted, and that flares are lit and operating with this 98% efficiency all of the time. Until recently, neither of these assumptions had been rigorously tested in real-world environments, and both have significant implications for the amount of methane that could be emitted from flaring. In this year's report, we discuss a recent science paper from September 2022, published by the Fuel team based out of the University of Michigan, which measured flare destruction efficiency at over 300 flare sites in the US unconventional fields of the Bakken, Eagle Ford, and Permian. Their analysis showed that the flares sampled operated with a destruction efficiency of 95.2%, so much lower than the 98% default. The team also conducted a complementary study to establish the prevalence of unlit flares in these fields, and concluded that of the flares sampled, 4.1% were unlit and therefore directly venting methane to atmosphere. Combining these two data points, the measured destruction efficiency and that 4.1% of flares were unlit, the team concluded that the sampled flares were operating with an effective destruction efficiency of 91.1. If these findings are representative of all flares in the US, it would have a significant implication for estimates of methane emissions. The chart on the left shows the estimates of emissions from US flaring using the current default of 98 in dark blue, the measured destruction efficiency in the paler blue, and then accounting for the prevalence of unlit flares, the lightest blue. Using an effective destruction efficiency of 91.1, methane emission estimates from US flares would be over 5 times higher than the values currently being reported under the US Greenhouse Gas Reporting Programme. Now, there are many reasons why it would not be appropriate to conclude that this is representative of all flares globally, not least because these unconventional fields are not representative of the majority of oil and gas production sites, but it does serve to highlight the scale of the challenge ahead of us. At any given time, flares may be lit and operating effectively, lit and operating ineffectively with incomplete combustion of methane, unlit and active and venting methane directly to the atmosphere, or unlit and inactive with no associated emissions. Further research is needed to better understand both flare destruction efficiency and the prevalence of unlit flares globally. However, in the meantime, and irrespective of the uncertainty surrounding methane emissions from flaring, there are critical steps operators can take now to reduce emissions. First, ensure that flares are always lit and have automatic reignition systems for when they should go out. Ensure flares are operating effectively and optimize flare destruction efficiency. And of course, reduce and eliminate the volumes of gas going to the flare, which should be the ultimate goal. And that concludes the presentation for today. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to taking questions.
Thanks a lot, Zubin and Debbie, from a truly wide-ranging and thought-provoking presentation that places flaring reduction firmly in the pathways to improve operations, better access to affordable and reliable sources of energy, and to reducing greenhouse gas emissions as a key element of the energy transition. And that should raise many different questions for our Q&A. Just a reminder that you can still use the Q&A box within the webinar platform to ask questions, and it is located at the bottom of your screen. And it looks like we have already some questions in. So I'm going to start with one that I guess could be answered by both of you, Zubin and Debbie. And this is, what is the World Bank and GGFR doing to help oil-producing countries lower the overall emissions from not just flaring, but also venting and fugitive emissions?
Thanks, Lorena. Maybe I'll take it first, and Debbie can come in if I forget to mention anything. So our support and technical assistance to governments and NOCs really runs the gamut. It can be from helping them on the regulatory side and the policies that we think the governments should put in place to make gas flaring reduction far more conducive and incentivized. That's one component, and where we do a lot of work on regulation with governments to advise them on what are some of the best practices and what seems to be the most effective means to regulate flaring and venting. And actually, if you go to our website again, we have a portal on regulation where we look at the policies and regulatory frameworks in many oil-producing countries around the world. This portal will give you a sense of what works, what may not be working so effectively. And then you can also do a comparison side by side of two countries or two jurisdictions, I should say, and their regulatory frameworks. So that's where we spend a lot of our policy work and time on the regulation side of things, where governments need some sort of guidance and support in developing regulatory frameworks. This also applies to some of our lending operations that the World Bank does in these countries. So, for example, if country X is interested in getting some money from the World Bank, we have what's known as a development policy operation. It's a type of loan where a government gets a significant quantity of money. Usually it's around 500 million, could be as much as a few $billion, US dollars. And the government has to go through what we call prior actions in order to receive that money. They have to sort of satisfy some key issues that the World Bank and the government have negotiated prior to finalizing this loan. So in some countries, and in fact, in just the last year and a half, 2 years, we have had prior actions on gas flaring and venting reduction in several countries. There's one country in particular that, should they want to receive money from the World Bank in the form of a loan, they have to reduce their flaring by about 15%, 1.5, in just a year and a half, 2 years' time. So these are the types of things we work with on the regulation side. Then on the technical side, of course, we do a lot of guidance and technical advice to governments and NOCs on what are the technical solutions to flaring and venting reduction. So Debbie and a few other colleagues on our technical team are constantly looking at the new technologies, the emerging technologies, the modular technologies that could be used for maybe some small volume gas flares in remote regions. Think of, the Amazon, or think of the desert, or even think about large flaring countries like Russia, where you have flaring going on in Western and Eastern Siberia, but the markets for the associated gas being all the way over in Europe and in the western side of the country. So what are the technical solutions in those kinds of instances? And then finally, if a government is interested in doing gas flaring and venting reduction, they can also come to the World Bank to see what's possible in terms of financing that gas flaring reduction. And if you go to our website, just last year, we released a report on the financing options for not just flaring and venting, but also on methane, and what sources of finance that an operator could look at to help them with the financing aspects of flaring reduction. And then lastly, let me just say that our work program and the way we help governments with flaring reduction is also on this monitoring aspect, right? Every year when we launch this report, our flaring tracker report, it generates a lot of attention and it keeps gas flaring top of mind for many governments and NOCs, and hopefully also independent and operators and IOCs, that this is something that the industry now has to really pay attention to and deliver a product in the cleanest manner possible. There are going to be regulations being put in place in many jurisdictions around the world when they import oil and gas, and what is the footprint of that product. And those that are reducing their emissions from production are going to be far more attractive in some of these jurisdictions in terms of selling that product. So these are some of the things that we support governments and companies with. Debbie, I don't know if I missed anything. Debbie?
No, nothing from me. Well done.
Okay.
I was on mute, sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, I hope that answered the question, Lorena.
Yes, very well. Thank you so much. I'm going to jump into another question as actually, how does a company reduce, I lost the Q&A, just 1 second. How does a company reduce the volume of gas going to a flare?
Debbie, you want to take that one? And I can
Sure. I mean, it really depends on the reasons that that gas is being flared in the first place. So it may be that it's due to a lack of infrastructure to take that gas away and get it to market. So there may be a lack of connectivity into a pipeline network, or a lack of compression or something else to get that gas away. It could be because of upset conditions in the facility. So it could be episodic flaring. But the steps that companies can take to reduce flare volumes really involves a robust flare management strategy, and the guidance that Lorena mentioned at the beginning of the presentation is going to be really helpful with that. So I guess the answer is it depends on the reasons that the gas is being flared. If it's a case of there's nowhere else for the gas to go, and that's something that requires a bit of an infrastructure and investment strategy to commercialize that gas stream and get it to market. If it's about controlling episodic non-routine flaring, and that's about operational discipline and developing a great philosophy and operating philosophy around flare management, and potentially installation of flare recovery systems to recycle that flare volume back into the process instead of having it go to flare. So many different reasons why one might flare and many different solutions to try and attack that flare volume.
Okay. Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Debbie. I'm going to ask another question, and I think there has been already some interactions in the chat box, but for everybody, what is the data source for quantities of gas flare?
Yeah, Debbie definitely knows a lot more about this, but let me just say again, if you go to our website, we have our full methodology on how we do our satellite detection. So there are two fairly new satellites that were launched by the United States government in 2012 and 2017, I believe it was. And the advanced sensors of these satellites detect the heat emitted by gas flares as infrared emissions. This is done with a partnership that we have with the Colorado School of Mines and the Payne Institute for Public Policy. And these infrared emissions are then calibrated using country-level data collected by a third-party data supplier. And this gives us the robust estimates that we think are quite accurate on flaring volumes. Debbie, do you want to talk a little bit more about our...
No, it's good. So thank you for putting, I was going to suggest the link to the methodology. So thank you for putting that into the chat. I will say that we've also been working really hard with the Colorado School of Mines and a number of different organizations to try and improve data quality as a journey, always not a destination. And we've been trying to work with various organizations to improve that calibration step, and more to come on that over the course of this year. And where we've been looking at controlled release experiments, where we've been timing controlled flaring scenarios with satellite overpasses, and we know the volume of gas going to the flare device, as well as gathering a wealth of data from real world operations and using that to help the calibration. So very much a work in progress and something that we're continually working with our esteemed partners at the Colorado School of Mines.
Yeah, if I could also add to Debbie's, that, yeah, it's very much something that we want to get right. And we're constantly trying to seek ways to improve this and make sure that we are accurate. And to that end, what we always ask operators and companies and governments to do is come to us and go to our website, see what our data shows. And if you think we have it incorrect, please do contact us, because we want to get it right and make sure that it's as accurate as possible. We have a high degree of confidence, but as Debbie said, you know, nothing is perfect, especially when you're looking at satellite data and trying to quantify and then do calibration and all of that work. So again, we do a lot of work to check and double check and make sure we're getting this right. And over the years, we think it's really improved a lot. But, you know, we welcome your inputs and thoughts on if you see something that looks off to you, please get in touch and let us know, and we'd be happy to discuss it with you.
Great. Thanks a lot for the answer. I got another question in terms of what is the belief of the accuracy of flooding data from the satellite measurements? And are there actual measurements of flooding volumes to calibrate satellite data?
So yeah, I think we kind of answered that in that discussion there, but we have a high confidence in the satellite's ability to detect a flare. So we have a high confidence in the fact that these are flares that we're seeing. The real proof comes in then that calibration of the radiant heat that the sensor is measuring against the volume of gas that's being emitted. And as I said, that's an ongoing journey. We do think we have a fairly robust data set, and we absolutely invite and encourage operators to come forward if they have data that is contrary to what we're showing on our website for their particular flares, and glad to have that discussion.
That's great. Thanks a lot for that. So I will go with another question based on your research for non-assisted flare in upstream oil and gas industries. What is the flare combustion efficiency? Is there any chance to improve it and minimize methane slip from the flare?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this is an area that we're really increasingly hoping to be more active in at the moment. We're pursuing some collaborations and connections with various university groups that are looking at the science of flare destruction efficiency. So typically one would assume for a non-assisted flare with a high BTU, a high calorific value of gas going to the flare, you'd tend to think that would mean that flare would operate with a fairly high combustion efficiency. And the measurements that have been done on this to date do suggest that could be higher than that 98%. However, the real issue that we have as an industry at the moment is a robust way to measure flare destruction efficiency. That is really very challenging in the real world environment. There isn't really a reference method that we can use easily. So we're exploring a range of different technologies that might help industry get a better handle on this issue. Where flares are operating inefficiently, of course, there are things that can be done to improve that destruction efficiency, but our focus at the moment is trying to understand how we can measure that and how we can then apply that methodology to a significant number of flares in various real-world operating environments, so we can try and get an understanding of what factors are influencing flare destruction efficiency.
Good, that's excellent. Thanks a lot. So here we have so many questions. I'm just trying to choose some of them. So how can we find new and emerging technology for flare reduction? Is there any good source of information for this that you could recommend?
Yeah, I'd like to think we're... go ahead, Debbie. I was just I'd like to think we're a good source of it. Again, if you go to our website, you'll see some reports that we published over the past few years on some of the technologies available. The most recent one was on small-scale technology, but Debbie, please go ahead. You know more about this again.
Absolutely right. Please go to our website. We have a lot of information there particularly on small-scale technologies, and that's a space that we continue to watch and keep track of. And if there are any technology providers or any folks out there on the call that believe they have technology that may be useful, we invite you to reach out to us, please, so we can learn more about it and see if it's something we would like to include in our database.
Great, brilliant. There are more questions around your methodology, and as your methodology use infrared, does that mean offshore flaring emissions are excluded, or are you considering them as well?
So no, the database includes offshore flaring. So the satellite is actually detecting heat, the heat signature of the flare, which is flares are hottest heat signature and hottest terrestrial source on the planet, even hotter than volcanoes. So the satellite is actually detecting heat, and we have a fairly robust data set in the offshore as well. So no limitations there. I saw a second question there about, maybe if I just answer this one as well, because it's related around the limits of satellite data cloud cover. So we do have a challenge with cloud coverage that is corrected for in the methodology. And again, I would encourage you to go to the link that Zubin shared in the Q&A box about the methodology, which is available on our website. And again, this is an area that we are constantly striving to improve, and we have a team of very talented remote scientists working at the Colorado School of Mines working on this issue. So.
Great, thanks so much, Debbie, for that. Are there any examples where a company or a country actually choose to import gas based upon the IFT index?
Zubin, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sorry, Lorena, could you repeat that? Are there
Yes.
countries that have actually...
Examples where a company or a country is importing gas based upon the IFT index, or they are focusing rather on costs or other points?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So as I mentioned, we just introduced this IFG index not too long ago. And after we communicated and launched the index, we did enter into a conversation and dialogue with some governments around the world. And it was quite revealing to some of them. A few even said things like, we had no idea because we hadn't even thought along these lines. So thank you for that. Whether a country or an operator has sort of now used that to make a decision is not something we would be aware of, right? These are bilateral discussions usually between the importer and the exporter, and the World Bank wouldn't necessarily be privy to that. So it's hard to know, except the initial feedback that we got when we released this IFT index. And as I mentioned, a lot of people within the World Bank as well as externally all said it was quite a powerful metric because, you know, previously we had always focused on the operators and those that were doing the flaring, which is where the attention should be, of course. But this kind of flipped it a little bit, right? And it said, you as an importing country have a responsibility and an influential role to play in reducing flaring and venting and methane emissions from oil and gas production. Because as a buyer, you can look at your sources and you know, make some decisions as to regarding your emissions and your footprint from that production. So we think it's a powerful metric, and that's kind of the feedback we got since we launched it. But as far as being able to tell you, you know, specific examples, that's not something that we would be able to do.
Great. Thanks a lot for that, Zubin. I'm going to come back to one of the areas that you have already covered slightly, and I would like to know, according to these questions, what are the main reasons flooding persists year on year, and what are the main challenges to flooding reduction?
Yeah, I would have to say the main challenges to flaring reduction are twofold. Well, maybe more than twofold, but the two primary things that we always talk about. One is the prioritization by a government or an operator and the political will. So in other words, you know this is an issue. Are you now willing to pay attention to it and put the resources and time to solving it? that's really the first step. The second step then is usually, do you have the regulatory and policy environment within the country that makes operators think that, look, flaring is no longer in our economic or other interests, and that we have to do something about it. So that would be the other point I would make is, do you have the regulations and the policies in place? The foundation to flaring reduction, we think, is often good regulation that's well balanced and isn't too tilted towards either the operator or to the government in terms of incentivizing it. So those are really the main barriers that we see. Financial, of course, is a big barrier. But there are sources of financing for flaring and venting reduction. And again, encourage you to look at our report. And if you're a government or an NOC, please do contact us if this is something that interests you, and we can discuss it further.
Great. Thanks a lot for that, Vint. I would like to focus now a little bit more on these comments that you have made in terms of methane emissions that could be higher due to flaring. And you said that you have some plans to evaluate this in more detail. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Sure.
So, go ahead, Debbie.
No, go on. Sorry.
No, thanks for asking that question. It's a good sort of end note for us, at least. So over the last few years, as many of you are aware, methane emissions from oil and gas production has received a ton of attention. There's the Global Methane Pledge, and there's a lot of initiatives and organizations that have come up in the last few years to address methane emissions from flaring and venting and oil and gas operations, including the Methane Guiding Principles. That is an industry type event for which we are a part of at the World Bank, and so is IPCA. So, I think the level of attention is there now. The question is, what are the actions being taken by governments and operators? So we think at the World Bank, there's a gap there in terms of what all of the activities are in methane reductions globally in the oil and gas sector. A lot is being done, but there are some gaps that we at the World Bank think we can fill, whether it being helping developing countries that lack the capacity and the knowledge to understand how methane emissions are detected, how methane emissions are quantified, and then what are some of the abatement solutions that are out there. We have relationships with just about every country on Earth and have offices in 120 countries around the world. So we have this ongoing dialogue with the government of a country in terms of what are the economic priorities for the government to help improve the livelihoods of people. And flaring and methane reduction hopefully is part of that conversation in many oil-producing countries. So the World Bank now and we with GGFR, which will soon be the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership, are there to help countries understand what the methane emissions are from the oil and gas sector and what are the solutions. And then if the government does prioritize it, then we're there also to help them understand how the financing could potentially work. If it's not from the World Bank, then what are the other sources of financing from methane and flaring reduction? So that's the type of work we hope to do in the future. And as Debbie said, we'll continue with our technical work, which is, are we detecting these methane emissions and flare sites with as much accuracy as possible? Do we understand how much methane is being emitted from the flares? What's the flare destruction efficiency? We'll have our ongoing technical programs to understand the technical aspects of methane and flaring. We'll have our regulatory program that looks at policies and regulations on flaring and methane, and to help governments with that as well. So that's kind of the work that we hope to do in the future, all with the goal of really achieving our zero routine flaring initiative, and also the goals of the Global Methane Pledge, which, as many of you know, is a 30% reduction by 2030, I believe. I hope I didn't get that wrong. So we would like to support that effort as well. Did I miss anything, Debbie? Did I get anything wrong? More important.
No.
That's great, and I'm really looking forward to learning more in the near future about the global flooding and methane reduction partnership. If you don't mind, I have a couple of more questions, Debbie and Zubin, if you are up for them. One is the oil-producing countries, mainly in conflict areas, invest capital when oil prices are high or stable. And once the oil prices goes down, the capital stops, and then project is put on hold. It again starts after a few years. So can the World Bank step in and ensure funding is made available for projects during the lean period? And because this might help to reduce flooding significantly. Debbie or Zubin, I don't know if you would like to take.
Yeah, sure. I can take that one. So again, I think it's a good question, and our job, as it always is to push for our agenda in many of these countries. So as you can understand, that the World Bank works in all sectors of the economy, whether it's healthcare, education, transportation. And when the World Bank enters into a dialogue with the government about what the priorities are for the government, our role is to advocate for our work, which is flaring and methane reduction. So we sort of compete within the World Bank and with the country offices that we have in many countries to be on the agenda for that government. So that's the first thing that we work really hard to do and see if we can get included in the agenda. Then the second step is what type of support a country needs. And the government obviously leads in this regard. We do provide some, thinking and analysis from the World Bank side as to what we think would help a country develop economically. But of course, it's the government's ultimate decision. And if they prioritize flaring and methane reduction, then we come in and do an overall analysis of what we think they probably need to do to achieve that goal. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the dynamic we're dealing with every day. Obviously, when there was the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, our agenda sort of fell to the bottom of priorities for many developing countries because they were just trying to keep their citizens alive and healthy. And so we took a step back, of course, and said, look, this is important, but we recognize, this is something that we can re-engage with the government on in the future when things subside and return to normal. And we've started seeing that now in the last year or so, which is encouraging that governments are getting this back into a priority, especially most of the oil and gas producing countries.
That's great. Debbie, I don't know if you would like to add anything to that.
No, all good. Thank you.
Good. Could I realize that we are past the hour? We still have a couple of questions on the chat box. If you don't mind, maybe we come back to you via email, Zubin and Debbie, if you are fine up to that. And good, great. So just for me to say a huge thanks to both of you, Zubin and Debbie, and our presenters today for the excellent presentations and for being put on the spot and answering such a wide range of questions. And thanks to all of you on the line for taking the time out to listening and asking questions. And as mentioned earlier, a recording of the webinar will be available in the next couple of days with a link to the slides and can be accessed on the same link as the live webinar. And don't forget that you can download the World Bank Global Gas Flooding Tracker Report for 2023 and the IPCA, GGP, and GGFR guidance document on flooding management for the oil and gas industry from the resources feature. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the week and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.